There is a place between dying and death where time loses its grip on a man. Arthur Morgan knew this place. He had felt it creeping into his lungs for months, that slow fire that ate him from the inside, the tuberculosis that turned every breath into a negotiation with God. He remembered the mountaintop. He remembered the sunrise. He remembered the feeling of letting go. And then there was nothing. Not darkness exactly, but absence. A void with no walls and no floor and no ceiling. Just the quiet hum of something vast and unknowable deciding what to do with the soul of an outlaw who had spent his final days trying to be a good man. When light returned, it did not come gently. It cracked open like a gunshot, and Arthur felt earth beneath his back. Real earth, damp and cold and smelling of rot. His fingers curled into mud and dead leaves. His chest expanded and air rushed in, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was no pain, no rattle, no blood on his lips. Just clean, sharp air filling lungs that had no right to work this well. He opened his eyes to a sky choked with gray clouds. Trees stood around him, bare and skeletal, their branches reaching upward like the hands of drowning men. The forest was silent in a way that forests should never be silent. No birds, no insects. No wind threading through the canopy. Just a heavy pressing stillness that sat on the land like a funeral shroud. Arthur sat up slowly and looked at his hands. They were his hands, calloused and scarred and weathered by decades of living hard under an unforgiving sun. He was wearing his clothes, his worn leather jacket, his boots, his gun belt. He reached down and felt the familiar weight of his cattleman revolver on his hip and the repeater slung across his back. His satchel was there too, and inside it his journal, pressed between worn leather covers like a confession waiting to be read. He stood and turned in a slow circle, scanning the tree line the way a man does when he has spent a lifetime reading landscapes for threats. Nothing moved, but something was wrong. The air carried a smell beneath the dampness, something sweet and sickening, the unmistakable perfume of decay. Not animal decay. This was heavier, more human. Arthur Morgan had buried enough people and left enough unburied to know that smell in his bones. Somewhere nearby, something had died, and not long ago. He pulled the revolver from its holster and held it low at his side, the barrel angled toward the ground, ready but not raised. A habit learned from years of walking into places where the wrong move got you killed. He did not know where he was. He did not know how he had gotten here. The last thing he remembered was the sun rising over a mountain and the feeling of something lifting off his chest. He was supposed to be dead. Yet here he stood, breathing easy in a dead forest, with the stench of rot growing thicker with every step he took forward. Whatever waited beyond these trees, Arthur walked toward it the way he always had. Not with courage exactly, but with the stubborn refusal of a man who had already accepted the worst and found it survivable. The first one emerged from behind a rusted pickup truck that sat half sunk in the mud at the edge of an overgrown road. Arthur saw the movement before he saw the shape, a slow, lurching shuffle like a drunk stumbling out of a saloon at 3 a.m. But drunks had rhythm in their chaos. This thing had none. It moved with the mechanical persistence of something that had forgotten how bodies were supposed to work, but refused to stop trying. Arthur raised the revolver and held his breath the way he always did before a shot, letting his heart beat slow, letting the world narrow to the space between the front sight and the target. Then the thing stepped into the light, and Arthur Morgan, a man who had faced down gangs and bears and federal agents, felt his stomach turn. It had been a woman once, maybe middle-aged, maybe younger. It was hard to tell because the skin had gone gray and loose, hanging from the bones like wet paper. One eye was missing entirely, the socket a dark hollow that glistened with something Arthur did not want to identify. The other eye was clouded and milky, staring at nothing and everything at the same time. Its jaw hung at an angle that meant the bone was broken, and from the open mouth came a sound that Arthur had never heard before. Not a groan exactly, not a scream. Something in between, a low, wet, gurgling moan that carried no emotion, no thought, no pain, just hunger. It saw him, or sensed him. Whatever mechanism drove this thing, it locked onto Arthur and began shuffling toward him with an arms-outstretched persistence that was more terrifying than any charge he had ever faced. Because a man charging at you with a knife had fear in his eyes. A man with a gun had calculation. This thing had nothing. Its face was as blank as a stone wall and just as indifferent to negotiation. Arthur fired. The bullet caught the thing in the chest and punched through, and it did not even flinch. It kept coming, that moan rising and falling like some horrible breathing exercise. Arthur felt a cold wire of fear thread through his gut. He had hit it clean center mass. That shot would have dropped any man alive. This was not a man alive. He adjusted his aim and fired again. The second bullet went through the forehead, and the effect was instantaneous. The thing crumpled like a marionette whose strings had been cut, folding in on itself and collapsing to the wet road in a heap of dead weight and silence. Arthur stood there, revolver still raised, smoke curling from the barrel, his eyes fixed on the body. It did not move. Whatever mockery of life had animated it was gone now, leaking out through the hole in its skull along with something dark and thick that was not quite blood. He had killed men before, more than he could count, more than he wanted to remember. But this was different. This was not a killing. This was something else entirely, an ending of something that should have already ended. And as he stood over the corpse, trying to make sense of what his eyes were telling his brain, he heard the sound again. That low moaning. Not from one direction this time, but from several. Coming from the tree line behind him. Coming from the road ahead. Coming from somewhere past the abandoned truck and the collapsed fence and the farmhouse whose windows stared out like empty eyes. There were more of them, many more. Arthur reloaded with hands that did not shake because he would not allow them to shake. He counted 12 rounds. He had more in his satchel, but not an infinite supply. Whatever these things were, bullets to the body did nothing. Only the head mattered. Only the brain. He began walking, not running, toward the farmhouse. A man on foot in open ground with enemies closing from multiple directions needed walls and a door and something solid between himself and the things that wanted to eat him. Because that was what they wanted. He had seen it in that ruined face. There was no malice in those cloudy eyes, no hatred. Just a bottomless, mindless appetite that would never be satisfied, that would keep driving these rotting shells forward until they found flesh or found a bullet. Arthur Morgan had ridden with killers and thieves and men who would burn a town for pocket money. He had never encountered anything that frightened him the way these walking corpses did. Not because they were dangerous, though they were, but because they were empty. There was no soul behind those eyes to reason with, no fear to exploit, no humanity to appeal to. Just the dead walking hungry and endless. The farmhouse offered shelter but not comfort. Arthur barricaded the doors with overturned furniture and checked every room with the revolver leading the way. The house was empty, but it had not always been. There were signs of habitation everywhere. Canned food wrappers on the kitchen counter. A sleeping bag rolled up in the corner of the living room. Marks on the walls where someone had tallied days, one straight line after another marching across faded wallpaper like a prison sentence being counted down. Whoever had lived here had left in a hurry or been dragged out against their will. Either way, they were gone now, and Arthur had the place to himself. He spent the first night listening to them. The dead gathered outside the way wolves gathered around a campfire, drawn by the scent of something alive inside. They pressed against the walls and scratched at the boarded windows with fingers worn down to bone. That sound, that relentless scraping, followed Arthur into a shallow, restless sleep and greeted him when he woke before dawn. By morning they had drifted away, pulled by some new stimulus, some distant sound or scent that drew them like moths to a flame. Arthur used the daylight to move. He followed the road south, reading the landscape the way Dutch had taught him decades ago, looking for water sources, elevated ground, signs of organized habitation. If they were dead walking the earth, there had to be living people somewhere trying to survive. And where there were living people, there would be answers. He found them on the third day. Not a settlement exactly, but a camp. A cluster of vehicles arranged in a loose circle around a clearing, tarps strung between trees, a fire pit with smoke still rising from the ashes. Armed men and women moving with the tense efficiency of people who had been living on the edge for a long time. Children too, a handful of them sitting in the dirt with the hollow-eyed silence of kids who had learned that crying attracted things that could kill you. Arthur approached with his hands visible and his revolver holstered. He announced himself from 50 yards out because surprising armed survivors was a quick way to earn a bullet. A man met him at the perimeter. tall and lean with a sheriff's hat pushed back on his head and a python revolver on his hip that Arthur recognized as a fine weapon. The man's eyes were sharp and tired in equal measure, the eyes of someone who had been making impossible decisions every day for longer than any person should have to. They talked. The man's name was Rick, and he spoke with the careful, measured words of a leader who had learned that every sentence carried weight. He explained what had happened to the world. A plague or a virus or something that no one fully understood had turned the dead into walking predators. Society had collapsed. Governments had fallen. The military had been overwhelmed. What remained was scattered groups of survivors fighting over dwindling resources, while the dead multiplied with every person who fell. Arthur listened and said little. He had always been a better listener than talker. But inside his mind was working, turning over the information and fitting it against everything he had seen. The empty roads, the abandoned cars, the silence where birdsong should have been. It all made a terrible kind of sense now. What struck him hardest was not the dead. It was the living. Over the days that followed, as Rick's group accepted his presence with the cautious gratitude of people who needed every capable body they could get, Arthur watched the way survivors treated each other. He saw the fear that lived behind every interaction, the calculations people made before sharing food or water or ammunition, the way trust had become a currency more valuable than gold and twice as dangerous to spend. He had seen this before. Not the walking dead, not the collapsed cities, but the human part. The part where desperate people turned inward and the strong took from the weak, and the line between survival and cruelty blurred until you could not tell where one ended and the other began. He had lived this story with Dutch van der Linde. He had watched a family of outlaws eat itself alive as the world closed in around them. He had seen loyalty curdle into paranoia and leadership decay into tyranny. This world was different in its details, but identical in its bones. The dead were just a new kind of law closing in, a new kind of civilization pushing people to the margins. And the people at the margins were doing what people at the margins always did. They were turning on each other. They were building little kingdoms out of fear and defending them with violence. They were becoming the very thing they were trying to survive. Arthur Morgan had seen empires of desperation before. He knew how they ended. Badly. Always badly. The question was whether this time in this broken world he could do something to change that ending, or whether he was just another outlaw riding through someone else's tragedy, leaving nothing behind but hoofprints and graves. Arthur Morgan was not a scientist. He was not a strategist in the way that military men use the word. He did not understand supply chains or infrastructure or the logistics of rebuilding civilization from its ashes. But he understood survival in ways that most of these modern people did not, because survival had been his entire life. He knew how to track. He could read footprints in mud the way a scholar reads text on a page, extracting direction and speed and weight and intent from impressions most people would walk right over. He knew how to hunt, not with the anxious fumbling of weekend sportsmen, but with the patient, practiced silence of a man who had fed himself and others from the land for 30 years. He could dress a deer in minutes. He could set snares that caught rabbits while he slept. He could identify edible plants and clean water sources by sight and smell alone. These skills, which had been ordinary in his world, were extraordinary in this one. The survivors in Rick's group were modern people stripped of modernity. They knew how to drive cars and operate computers and navigate a world of electricity and running water, but that world was gone. What remained was the older world, the world of campfires and hunting trails and reading the sky for weather. Arthur's world, he taught them. Not with lectures or authority, but with the quiet demonstration of a man who simply did things and let others watch and learn. He showed the younger ones how to set a trap line along a creek bed. He taught the women and men alike how to sharpen a blade properly, drawing the edge along a stone at the right angle until it could split a hair. He demonstrated how to move through a forest without making a sound, placing each foot deliberately, rolling from heel to toe, using the natural noise of the environment to mask your passage. The group began to change around him, not dramatically, not overnight, but in small ways that compounded. Hunting parties came back with more food. Scouting runs produced better intelligence. The camp itself was reorganized based on Arthur's suggestions, the vehicles repositioned to create better sightlines, the fire pit moved to a location where smoke would disperse through the canopy instead of rising in a visible column. Rick watched all of this with the quiet attention of a man who recognized competence. The two of them developed an understanding that did not require many words. Rick led because people needed someone to follow. Arthur contributed because standing idle while others struggled was something he could no longer stomach. They were different men from different worlds separated by more than a century of history, but they shared something fundamental. Both of them had been broken by the weight of leadership. Both of them knew what it cost to make decisions that kept some people alive at the expense of others. Both of them carried the dead with them, not the walking kind, but the remembered kind. The faces that visited in the quiet hours and asked questions that had no good answers. There were tensions, of course. Not everyone in the group welcomed Arthur's presence or his influence. A man named Shane watched him with the suspicious eyes of someone who saw every capable newcomer as a threat to his position. Shane was strong and aggressive and operated on an instinct for dominance that Arthur recognized immediately, because he had seen it in 100 men like him. Men who confused strength with leadership and volume with authority. Arthur avoided confrontation with Shane not out of fear but out of experience. He had spent years watching Dutch and Micah and Como Driscoll and a dozen other men whose egos turned every disagreement into a war. He knew that engaging with that kind of personality only fed it, gave it oxygen, gave it an enemy to define itself against. So he simply continued doing what he did. Scouting, teaching, making himself useful in ways that were impossible to argue with. But beneath the daily rhythm of survival, Arthur felt something stirring that he had not felt in a long time. Not the manufactured purpose that Dutch had sold him for years, the endless promises of one more score and one more plan and a future that never arrived. This was simpler than that, smaller and realer. These people needed help and he could help them. These children needed to eat and he could find food. This camp needed defending and he knew how to defend. It was not redemption. Arthur had stopped believing in redemption somewhere on that mountain when the sun came up and his lungs gave out. But it was something close to it. Something that felt like the first warm day after a long winter. Not a promise that everything would be fine, but proof that warmth still existed somewhere in the world. He sat by the fire at night and wrote in his journal, sketching the faces of the people around him and recording the things he had seen. The dead with their empty eyes, the living with their full ones. The children who laughed sometimes despite everything, because children are the last ones to surrender to despair. He wrote about Rick and the weight the man carried. He wrote about Shane and the danger he represented. He wrote about the strange, impossible fact that Arthur Morgan, a dead outlaw from a dead century, had somehow been given a second chance in a world that was itself dying. And he wondered, as he always wondered, whether he deserved it. The settlement called Woodbury appeared on the horizon like a mirage, a walled town with electric lights and paved streets, and the appearance of order in a world that had abandoned the concept entirely. Arthur heard about it before he saw it. Whispered references from traders and drifters who passed through the area with nervous energy of people skirting the edge of something powerful and dangerous. Rick's group debated whether to approach. Some argued for it, desperate for the security that walls and numbers and organization could provide. Others warned against it, citing rumors of a leader who ruled with charm and violence in equal measure. Arthur listened to both sides and said nothing, but his silence carried the weight of recognition. He had heard this story before. A charismatic man building a paradise in the wilderness, gathering followers, promising safety, demanding loyalty. He had lived inside that story for 20 years. Its protagonist was named Dutch van der Linde. When they finally encountered the governor, Arthur's suspicion crystallized into certainty. The man was polished and articulate and generous with his smile. He welcomed strangers with open hands and warm words. He spoke of community and rebuilding and the future of humanity. And behind his eyes there lived something cold and calculating that Arthur had learned to recognize the way a horse recognizes a rattlesnake, not through logic but through instinct honed by painful experience. The governor was Dutch. Not literally, not in the details, but in the architecture of his soul. The same grandiose vision masking a bottomless need for control. The same talent for making people feel chosen, special, part of something greater than themselves. The same willingness to sacrifice anyone who threatened the narrative he had constructed around himself. Arthur watched the governor move through Woodbury, shaking hands and patting shoulders and dispensing justice, and he saw Dutch walking through camp at Horseshoe Overlook, telling everyone that the plan was coming together, that they just needed faith. That word had been Dutch's weapon more than any gun. He wielded it like a blade, cutting away doubt, slicing through questions, carving loyalty into the hearts of people who wanted desperately to believe that someone had answers. The governor used the same blade. Different accent, different century, same steel. Arthur tried to warn Rick. He sat with the man in the quiet hours after the camp had gone to sleep and spoke more openly than he usually did. He told Rick about Dutch, about the way a leader could love his people and destroy them simultaneously, about how the line between protection and possession disappeared so gradually that by the time you noticed, you were already property. He told Rick about Guama and St. Denis and the slow collapse of everything he had believed in, watching a man he loved become a man he feared. Rick listened the way he always did, with that intense focused attention that made you feel like the only person in the world. And Arthur could see that Rick understood, not because the concept was new to him, but because Rick carried his own version of the same fear. The fear that leadership itself was the disease, that the act of making decisions for others inevitably corrupted the one who made them. Rick was terrified of becoming the thing he fought against. That fear, Arthur realized, was the only thing separating Rick from the governor. The governor had stopped being afraid. He had embraced the power and called it righteousness and built a kingdom on its foundation. The conflict between Rick's group and Woodbury escalated the way these things always do. Slowly at first, through small provocations and misunderstandings and territorial disputes. Then faster, as the governor's true nature emerged from behind the mask of civility like something crawling out of deep water. People died. Good people, people whose names Arthur had learned, whose children he had taught to set traps, whose trust he had earned through months of quiet, consistent effort. Arthur felt the old familiar grief settle into his chest like a stone. The grief of watching something precious be destroyed by something preventable. The grief of knowing that the monster was not the dead shambling through the fields, but the living sitting behind walls. It was Beaver Hollow all over again. It was the gang splitting apart. It was Hosea dying and Lenny dying and Sean dying while Dutch stood on a cliff somewhere making speeches about destiny. The dead were a force of nature. You could not reason with a hurricane or negotiate with a flood. You simply endured and adapted and survived. But the living chose their cruelty. The governor chose to be what he was. Every person who followed him and carried out his orders chose to participate in that darkness. And that choice, that specifically human decision to cause suffering when alternatives existed, was the real plague. The walkers were just the scenery. The true horror had always been the audience. The governor came with everything he had. Trucks and guns and soldiers and a tank that rolled through the morning fog like some prehistoric predator, slow and massive and inevitable. Arthur watched from the prison's upper walkway as the convoy assembled outside the fences, a precise military formation designed to communicate one message: surrender or die. Rick stood at the gate and tried to negotiate because that is what Rick did. He talked. He reasoned. He appealed to the humanity that he believed existed in every person, even those who had buried it so deep they had forgotten it was there. Arthur admired this about Rick and feared for him because of it. Talking to the governor was like talking to a river about changing course. The water would listen politely and then continue drowning you. Arthur positioned himself where he could be most useful, high ground with clear sight lines and enough cover to reload without exposure. He checked his weapons methodically. The cattleman revolver, cleaned and oiled, 6 rounds ready. The repeater, 15 rounds in the tube, the stock warm against his shoulder like the handshake of an old friend. His knife on his belt, sharpened to a razor edge that could open a man or an animal with equal efficiency. The others prepared around him, men and women he had come to know over the weeks since his arrival. Maggie, whose quiet strength reminded him of Sadie Adler and the way she channeled grief into purpose. Glenn, who fought with the desperate courage of someone protecting everything he loved. Daryl, the hunter, the tracker, the man who communicated more with silence than most people did with speeches. Arthur understood Daryl in the way that two people who grew up wild understand each other without explanation. They had both been raised by the world rather than by parents, shaped by hardship into something that civilized people found uncomfortable but effective. When the shooting started, it came all at once, a wall of sound that turned the morning into chaos. Bullets struck the prison walls and threw chips of concrete into the air like confetti at some terrible celebration. The tank round hit the main building and the concussion wave rolled through Arthur's chest and rattled his teeth. He steadied himself, raised the repeater, and began to work. Arthur Morgan was not the fastest draw who ever lived. He was not the most accurate marksman in any world. But he possessed something that decades of gunfighting had refined into an almost supernatural skill. He was calm. In the middle of noise and death and confusion, while other people's hands shook and their vision tunneled and their breathing turned to short, panicked gasps, Arthur became still. His heartbeat slowed. His vision cleared. Every shot he took was aimed, considered, deliberate. He did not waste ammunition on suppressive fire or panic shots into the general direction of the enemy. He picked targets, tracked their movement, waited for the moment between heartbeats, and squeezed the trigger with the gentle patience of a man threading a needle. The governor's soldiers began falling, not in clusters but one at a time, each one dropping with a precision that sent a ripple of uncertainty through the attacking force. Soldiers who had expected to overwhelm a ragged group of survivors found themselves facing something they had not prepared for. A marksman who shot like the angel of death had taken up a rifle and decided to intervene personally. Arthur moved between positions the way a predator moves through its territory, never staying in one place long enough to be targeted, appearing at a window and firing and disappearing before the return shots arrived. The repeater sang its sharp cracking song, and each note ended a life or changed a mind. Soldiers who had been advancing began to hesitate. Hesitation became retreat. Retreat became rout as the human instinct for self-preservation overrode loyalty to a leader who was watching his perfect army disintegrate. The governor himself remained untouched, standing behind his tank like a king behind castle walls, screaming orders that fewer and fewer people obeyed. Arthur watched him through the scope and felt his finger rest against the trigger with a pressure that was one breath away from ending everything. He could take the shot. The distance was manageable, the wind was low, the target was standing still. One bullet and the war was over. But Arthur did not fire. Not because he lacked the will, but because he had learned something in his first life that most people never understand. Killing a tyrant does not kill tyranny. Dutch had died and the world had not improved. Micah had died and the darkness he represented continued in 1,000 other men who would never know his name. Killing the governor would end this particular battle, but it would not end the pattern. Someone else would rise, build walls, gather followers, and become the thing that needed to be destroyed. The cycle would continue because the cycle was not about individuals. It was about the human tendency to trade freedom for security and security for power and power for cruelty. The battle turned. The governor's forces broke and scattered into the surrounding countryside, taking their wounded and leaving their dead. The tank sat abandoned in the field, its engine still running, a monument to ambition that had overreached. Inside the prison, people emerged from cover with the dazed expressions of survivors who had not expected to survive. There were injuries. There were losses. The cost of victory was written in blood on the concrete floors and in the tears of people holding the bodies of those who had not made it through. Arthur found Rick sitting alone against a wall, his hands covered in someone else's blood, his eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance that only he could see. Arthur sat down beside him and said nothing. There was nothing to say. They were alive and others were not, and the reason had more to do with luck than merit. That was the truth of violence that no story ever captured properly. It was not the best who survived. It was the fortunate. And fortune was a wheel that never stopped turning. The days after the battle passed in a strange suspended quiet. People rebuilt what could be rebuilt and mourned what could not. The prison was damaged but standing, its walls scarred but unbroken, a fitting metaphor for the people who lived within them. Arthur worked alongside the others, clearing rubble and reinforcing defenses and burying the dead with a care that he hoped communicated what his words could not. That every life had mattered, that every loss was felt. He thought about leaving. The impulse was familiar, the outlaw's reflex to keep moving, to stay ahead of whatever was coming, to never plant roots deep enough that losing them would hurt. He had lived his entire first life that way, always riding toward the next camp, the next score, the next horizon. Movement as medicine, distance as defense. But something held him here. Not a chain or an obligation, but something lighter and stronger. Connection. He had allowed himself to care about these people, and caring was an anchor that no amount of restlessness could drag. The children who ran to him when he returned from hunting, their faces bright with a joy that the world had tried and failed to extinguish. The adults who looked at him with a trust he had done nothing to earn except be present and be useful and be honest. Rick, who had become something Arthur had not had since Hosea. Not a leader to follow or a partner in crime, but a genuine friend whose company made the world feel less like a punishment. Arthur sat on the prison roof one evening and watched the sun go down over a landscape that was both beautiful and terrible. The fields were green with the wild growth of untended nature. The forests were thick and dark and full of things that wanted to kill you. And somewhere out there beyond the horizon, the dead walked in their millions, patient and relentless and eternal, the new weather of a world that had changed its climate forever. He opened his journal and turned to a blank page. The pencil moved slowly, forming words that came from somewhere deeper than thought. I have been given something I do not understand, a second life in a world that is ending. I do not know why, and I have stopped asking. The why does not matter. What matters is what you do with the time you were given. I was not a good man. I tried to become one, and I ran out of time. Now time has been returned to me in a place where goodness is harder than it has ever been, where every day is a choice between the easy wrong and the difficult right. I will not waste it. I will not ride away. I will stand here with these people and fight for something that Dutch only ever talked about. A life worth living. Not someday. Not after one more score. In the mud and the blood and the terrible beauty of a world that refuses to die. Arthur closed the journal and looked out at the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance a walker moaned, that low empty sound that had become the background music of existence. He listened to it without fear. He had been dead once. He knew what waited on the other side, and it was nothing to be afraid of. What mattered was this side, this breath, this moment. This improbable gift of being alive in a world full of death and choosing every single day to make that mean something. The outlaw from another century, the dying man who had been given new lungs and a new world and a second chance, sat on the roof of a prison and watched the stars come out one by one over a land of the walking dead. And for the first time in either of his lives, Arthur Morgan was exactly where he was supposed to be.